like that. Hi, everybody. Very happy to introduce Charles Beaumont. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your book?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me fine. My name is Charles Beaumont. First thing I have to say is that I'm not allowed to show my face due to the job I used to have. I used to work for MI6, or what is sometimes known as the Secret Intelligence Service. And as a result, there are one or two restrictions on how I present myself and so on. But I hope that means that you can enjoy looking at the cover of my book, and then you won't get to forget anything about it. So, A Spy at War is my second novel. It is the sequel to A Spy Alone, which came out in 2023. And before I talk about A Spy at War, I will just say a little bit about A Spy Alone, just to give you the context. So, A Spy Alone is set in the present day. Well, strictly speaking, it's set in 2022, and it depicts current events and effectively a sort of espionage ring that is operating, a ring of Russian agents that is operating at the heart of the British establishment. And I suppose in some respects, that's a very sort of classical and well-worn trope in spy literature, the idea of there being double agents in senior positions in our society. But what I felt made this book slightly different was the fact that I set it in the present day. So we're very familiar with this idea of a sort of Cold War setting of double agents and spies and so on. But in the present day, I think it's less common. And the reason I did that was actually because I like my books to try to say something about current events. And I felt that there was a story to be told about the way that Russia had become highly influential and almost manipulating elements of British politics. There are even arguments about whether there's a Russian hand in the Brexit vote, an argument which I think is still raging. So my novel tries to depict that idea and effectively to say, well, if there was a Russian spy ring at the heart of the British establishment in the present day, what would that be like? So that's A Spy Alone. A Spy at War, as I mentioned, is the sequel. And perhaps as one can see from the cover art, the events of A Spy at War take place largely in Ukraine, and they take place in the Ukraine of the present day, the Ukraine, of course, that is subjected to an invasion by Russia. And therefore, it is a book that it's about contemporary espionage. It's about the war between Russia and Ukraine. But it's also about, and this was something that I started writing about well over a year ago, it's about the ways in which Russia has used its influence operations to undermine support for Ukraine in the West, and particularly in America. So, although, as I mentioned, it's a book that was written, most of it was written last year, it in some ways anticipates some of the things that we've seen just in the last few weeks and months with the events of the Trump presidency and how they've very much shifted their stance on support for Ukraine, but also on kind of wider involvement in Europe. So as I hope I've described there, in both cases, my books are very much set in a contemporary kind of geopolitical framework, one that is very realistic and very present. And I suppose in that sense, that's where my own life experiences, having worked in the intelligence services, help, because I've got very much a sort of real-time understanding and knowledge of this world, and that I draw on from, as I say, from personal experience as well as from from research and so on. Just for example, I've spent a bit of time in Ukraine since the war begun. I had various reasons for being there, but that allows me to write about Ukraine from the perspective of someone who's experienced it as it is now since the Russian invasion, not just sort of historically. So I hope that gives you a sense of the books. I'll be very happy to say a bit more about them. But yeah, that probably kicks us off.
It does. It kicks us off very well. We've got a hello from Donna as well, who's watching.
Well, hello, Donna. Thank you for joining us.
And I think she's made another comment about glad you explained that. I think she's probably referring to the fact that we've put your book cover on instead of you.
Instead of me, yes. Yeah.
Do you think so? I read a lot for the author interviews, but I don't often read spy fiction outside of it. So do you think that kind of contemporary spy fiction is a bit less common?
Well, I think actually it's having a bit of a renaissance. So clearly, the classic spy fiction is the sort of the John le Carré type spy who came in from the cold, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and those are very much those sort of Cold War classics. But there has been a little bit of a kind of renaissance of contemporary spy fiction. So, and what's interesting about that is that I think there's a link between that and people who have experience of a practical first-hand experience of intelligence work. So I've obviously got a couple of books out now, and then I'm sure some readers will be familiar with the work of David McCloskey. He's an American author of spy novels. I think he's now published 3, am I right? 3 or 4? No, 3, and there's another one on the way. And he worked in the CIA in a relatively recent era. So again, he's very much somebody who draws on both contemporary knowledge of the espionage world and also sets his book in the present day. In addition to David McCloskey, there's interestingly another ex-CIA author, I.S. Berry, Ilana Berry, she is an American woman, who, yes, again, served in the CIA, served in I think in the Middle East in fairly recent times. So it's interesting that there's just been that perhaps a little surge of contemporary writers of spy fiction who also draw on their own life experiences, as it were, at the sharp end of this kind of work.
Do you find that you, if you sort of experience kind of spy fiction in media or in book form, do you find that you get angry at any kind of tropes in it or any sort of errors? Is there any like common errors that people make in the fiction that you would like to see corrected?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think there's often this debate around sort of authenticity, and there's kind of credibility and authenticity, and perhaps they're slightly different things. I think obviously, in a way, I would say that there are basically 2 broad streams of spy fiction, whether it's in the written form or on screen, and that is basically the sort of James Bond the James Bond model, and we might call it the George Smiley model. So obviously James Bond is the action hero. He can't be defeated. When he fires a gun, it never misses. He can drive a car faster than anyone else. He's a superhuman figure, and in a way, I mean, James Bond himself has sort of been superseded, perhaps by sort of Jason Bourne, or in some of the more recent perhaps crossover elements. I'm thinking Jack Reacher, perhaps not really a spy, but he is that kind of lone ranger, sort of superhuman guy. So you have that model. And I think it's fair to say that those books don't really try, or those stories don't try very hard to be realistic in the basic sense that you have this person who is superhuman, who is sort of indestructible. And then you have that kind of George Smiley model, who's obviously the protagonist of many of John le Carré's books and his genius spy, and George Smiley is physically unimpressive, and in fact, I mean, in the books in particular, he's described in fairly uncomplimentary ways in his sort of physical appearance, but he's clearly utterly brilliant, and so it's all about his ability to use his brain and his ability to achieve outcomes, you know, as a result of his kind of great intellect. So I think that second category, they are more realistic in the sense that espionage work, intelligence work, is basically about you know, intellectual effort. But it goes beyond that, because the really key relationship in intelligence work is the relationship between what you would call a handler and a source, or maybe a case officer and an agent. You know, the agent being the person who has the information, who is giving it, and the case officer being the handler, you know, the person who receives that information. And of course, to persuade someone to give you information that they shouldn't give you, that they're not allowed to give you, that is the basic task of spying. And I think, interestingly, that not much spy fiction really gets to the heart of that relationship, whereas in real life, that's arguably the most important element of it.
Donna has asked you a question. She says, do you think if you hadn't have had the career you did, you would have ended up becoming an author?
That's a very good question. Well, I definitely wouldn't have become an author of this kind of book. And I want to emphasize, you know, that the books are fiction. They're not a retelling of my life story, and of course, for legal reasons, I'm bound by the Official Secrets Act. I can't write you know, I can't write things that are just a thinly veiled disguise of real events. But yeah, I think people are understandably interested in the world of intelligence and espionage, and having had that career, it gives me a way into that world. It gives me an insight into that world that, yeah, you know, most people probably don't have the opportunity to get. I mean, I'm not saying not anyone. There are plenty of great writers of spy books who didn't work as spies, you know, but definitely it kind of gives you a head start. I suppose to conclude Donna's question, maybe I would have ended up writing other kinds of books. I mean, I don't know. Of course, you know, in the wider crime genre, the sort of the whodunits and the psychological thrillers, there's all kinds of other sort of categories there. And I wonder whether I definitely enjoy writing. I've enjoyed being a fiction writer. So yeah, so maybe there would have been another type of writing if I hadn't had this career.
Well, digging into the book that we're talking about today, The Spy at War, you sort of got two interesting sort of aspects to it, haven't you? Because you've got all the events in Ukraine, and then you've got sort of the events back in the UK.
Yeah.
As well, which I thought was quite interesting. That sort of dual, I wouldn't say dual timeline because it's the same thing, but like the sort of dual stories running at the same time.
Yeah. Well, thank you for noticing that. And yes, for me, I think in a way, what I was trying to illustrate is that in a way there are two wars, and I think we've seen this actually. Again, I mean, you know, not that I'm happy about this, but I think President Trump has sort of proved this. That there's a war on the battlefield, the war that a conventional war that we would understand it, which involves armies and involves, you know, people making advances and different operations and so on. And even if you're not involved in a military world, you know, we can all understand that kind of a war. But then there's another kind of war that is arguably just as important. You could argue it's even more important, which is the war that takes place in places like Whitehall, you know, government offices, maybe the Pentagon in America, the White House, maybe, you know, the NATO headquarters, those sorts of places. And that's a war about what decisions powerful people are making. So in the book, I depict this kind of war that's initially unfolding very much inside British government departments. And there are those that are saying, well, we shouldn't be backing Ukraine. You know, we've got our own priorities, and others who are, you know, making the counter argument. And as I say, I think what we've seen since the start of the new Trump presidency is just how important that other war is, because ultimately, if Ukraine's allies refuse to stand by it, it'd be very hard for Ukraine to continue to defend itself. So yeah, so having those two kind of separate fields of action were important to me, as they're important to the story, but also important for kind of depicting how these things happen in the modern world.
I think there was a scene in the book that I thought was really clever. That was they're in, I can't remember the name of the building, but there's like a meeting and it's been deliberately scheduled to be in a building that's like a maze.
Oh yes.
And like really hard to find, and it's all like done on purpose, and it's just really, you couldn't sort of imagine meetings like that happening all
Yes.
the time.
Yeah, and certainly so that, yeah, I think it's the Foreign Office building, which is famously, I mean, you find anyone who's spent time in the Foreign Office, they'll confirm to you that it's incredibly easy to get lost in there, even people who've worked there for years. And certainly there is that kind of there is a way in which, you know, again, some parts of the novel are dramatic in the classic sense, you know, that action takes place in a war zone. You expect drama, you expect things to go bang, but some of the drama is much more, I suppose, subtle. And so yeah, the decision taken by a sort of civil servant, you know, perhaps think of the kind of the slightly cynical people in Yes Minister, or even in more recently in The Thick of It, you know, those sorts of people who deliberately hold a meeting in a difficult place to find in the hope that various people won't turn up to the meeting, and possibly, you know, then a decision could be made a certain way. And I think that is quite a sort of realistic way in which these sorts of things happen.
I mean, you've also got the events in Ukraine, and you've got your characters there who are kind of more involved in the thick of it, good and bad, that are very interesting. Do you want to introduce us, like anyone who's watching who hasn't read your book, to the main kind of characters in there?
Yeah, of course. So we've got, the main protagonist, Simon Sharman, he's somebody who was previously an intelligence officer working for a British government intelligence service, but he's actually been out of that world in the official sense for a few years, and he ended up working in a kind of private intelligence, sort of private investigator job, and if we're honest, not very successfully. So he's somebody who's a little bit down on his luck, probably a little bit resentful of the way that his own career path has gone. And what happens in the first novel, just briefly, which would lead us into the second one, is that he gets hired for what he thinks is a private job, is a commercial client, but what actually transpires is that it's actually funded ultimately by a sort of obscure bit of the government, and they're trying to dig into a major Russian oligarch who has been sort of putting money into the British system, and they're trying to do that because there's a fear that this is a front for a kind of spy ring that has got inside the British establishment. So that's what happens in the first book. And during the story of the first book, one of Simon's close colleagues is killed by a Russian assassin, in fact, a Chechen Russian assassin. So Chechnya being, you know, one of the internal republics in Russia. And at the end of the first book, Simon finds that the assassin is now fighting in Ukraine on the Russian side. And of course, that's perfectly plausible. You know, many Chechens have been involved in the war in Ukraine on the Russian side. And so Simon travels to Ukraine on a kind of revenge mission. Now, one of the other key characters in both books is a woman, Sarah Duquesne, and she's an academic. She's an expert on Russian literature, Russian history, Russian politics, but she kind of has a double role. So, in addition to being an academic, she works as an advisor to the British government and to other governments on kind of Russian political matters, Russian intelligence matters, and that sort of thing. And she is, in a way, kind of the brains of the operation. She is somebody who is one might say pulling strings from behind the scenes. And I think as a reader, and possibly even as a writer, we never quite know whose side she's on. She seems to be one of the good guys, but she sort of keeps quite a lot up her sleeve, and I feel that that's an important aspect of her character, that she's a very sort of cautious and calculating person. at the same time as actually sort of being a love interest for Simon, albeit a relationship that struggles to get off the ground, I think is fair to say. So I think those are the two key characters. But then certainly in Ukraine, you have one or two others. There's a sort of there are Ukrainians. You've got a young Ukrainian sort of intelligence special forces officer called Elizaveta, to use her Ukrainian name. There's a few other characters who are important in Ukraine. There's a sort of anti-corruption activist who's involved there, and then one other character who's very significant in the second book is an old British retired intelligence guy who's a sort of very posh chap, John T. Vosper, who's a kind of sort of British aristocrat who'd been in the intelligence services in an earlier period, but he's sort of come out of retirement because he's got very passionate about the war in Ukraine and his desire to make a difference. So those are some of the key protagonists in the Ukraine part of the story. And then you've got characters in the London end of the story, including these kind of slightly cynical civil servants who seem to be working against Ukraine, and possibly, you know, they're in the pay of Russia. And one of those is a guy called Kamran Patel, who's become a sort of senior advisor in the cabinet office in London.
I'll ask you one of Donna's questions, and I'm going to come back to the story. Donna said, was your job as exciting as everyone thinks it was, or was it as mundane and slow as every other job?
I would say it's somewhere between the two. Definitely not as exciting as everyone thinks, because that takes us back to the sort of the James Bond question that, you know, James Bond isn't a real human. You know, he in real life, he wouldn't have sort of survived beyond that sort of first 10 minutes of the first James Bond movie. So obviously, you know, in real life, it is a job. Quite a lot of it takes place inside an office, but definitely elements of it were very exciting. There was a lot of travel involved, a lot of interesting experiences, a lot of meeting interesting people. No Aston Martins, no fancy gadgets.
But would you be able to tell us even if there were?
Well, that's a good point. So yeah, indeed, you have to take everything I'm saying with a bit of a pinch of salt. But yes, that's right. If there had been, maybe I wouldn't be allowed to say.
Although there are moments, I do believe you actually, about the no Aston Martins and fancy gadgets, because there are moments in the bits in Whitehall where people are kind of buried in paperwork in their office and things like that. They feel add like that element of believability to your story that there maybe isn't in some others.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, certainly that's, and I think in a way, you know, there is this thing that obviously drama and jeopardy classically in a sort of action thriller is all about, you know, who can pull their gun quicker, or, you know, those sorts of things. But a lot of drama and jeopardy can happen in settings such as in an office. You know, I mean, let's take another person who's writing contemporary spy fiction, Mick Herron, who's, you know, incredibly successful, and his books are brilliant, very funny, very, very, very clever, very dark. And Mick Herron writes fiction where almost all of it is really office politics. I mean, there is action in his books, but not very much of it. And I think, I mean, although Mick Herron, you know, by his own admission, was not involved in that world, so he's not drawing on a personal experience of it, but he has that sort of understanding that in some ways some of the things that can be interesting for people might not be sort of, you know, superhuman moments of action. In a way, I wrote the book. I wanted the reader to think that the protagonist wasn't that different to someone they might know, or that nothing the protagonist did was particularly something that they couldn't imagine themselves possibly doing, you know, or at least, you know, at some point in their lives, or, you know what I mean. So that it, again, that you don't need sort of magical people to be able to do these things. Whereas I feel that in a way, quite, you know, I like action. I'm definitely not sort of against action and all that excitement, but in a way, it's a bit of a get out for the writer, because their hero can always sort of fix any problem.
Well, I think as well, in this it's very honest, even in the action. So there's like some sticky situations, isn't there, and that the people in them think about them very honestly.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
and so yeah, and that was another thing that I wanted to express, that people do get scared and people do fumble with their weapons and forget to pull the slide on the top of a gun, so actually when you fire there's no bullet, or there are things like that, and again, the sort of the screw up factor, if people don't mind me using that word, is part of real life. And if you talk to, my background is not in the military, but if you talk to people in the military who've had experience of that kind of situation, they'll often have as much to say about everything that went wrong as the kind of classic sort of heroic, sort of James Bond style outcome. So again, I wanted to have something that would be exciting and would be gripping, but also felt very realistic.
so this is book 2. The first one I've read, and it can be read as a standalone, I think.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure you probably get more if you read them in order.
Yeah.
Do you have plans for other books?
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely, because this second book, again, one could read as a standalone. I strongly encourage people to read both. Obviously, it's in my interest. But there's definitely a third one on the way, which I'm working on, and that I believe. I say I believe because I'm not a big planner when I write. I'm a bit more of I sort of let the story take me where it's going to take me. But my current expectation is that the third book will take us to the sort of end of this story. So the story, which is basically about Simon Sharman, my protagonist, his relationship with Sarah, this sort of interesting professor who's also kind of pulling various strings, and this ring of spies that has kind of infiltrated the British establishment. That to me is a story over 3 books, and so I will conclude it in the third book.
Would you then sort of, you've got ideas for other books, or would you like to try sort of writing in a different genre?
Well, I've got loads of ideas. I think I want to carry on writing spy books. I think for 2 reasons. One is I think there's that we're in quite a good time. People seem to be reading a lot of spy books at the moment. As I've mentioned, I've mentioned David McCloskey. He's actually, as you can see, he's on the cover of the book. You've got Mick Herron. There are others, but there's definitely spy books. Nick Harkaway. So that's the son of John le Carré, who writes as Nick Harkaway, who then wrote the continuation. One of the sort of created a new John le Carré story, if you like. So I think it's a fruitful time. It seems that there's definitely an appetite for it. I would like very much to set some spy literature in a very different setting. So, for example, I think a situation in the Middle East, because in the end, I'm very interested in sort of geopolitical issues, in kind of current global struggles. And for example, I think the situation in the Middle East, both right now, but also in the sort of post 9/11 era, is very fascinating and very kind of rich ground for creating interesting stories. And one where, again, some of my own experiences might be able to sort of illuminate it a bit.
So how much, because obviously, like, your books read very believably, how much is based on kind of real events, and how much of it is like completely made up? Obviously, you can't base it on anything you've done, but
yeah. Well, so what I mean, one thing I'd just sort of add to be clear to listeners is that my own time working for the government is more than 10 years ago. So I wouldn't be, if I write about events in 2022, I'm writing from if you like, an insider's perspective because of my background, but not like an insider who's currently working in that world, which I think is important. But yeah, what I've tried to do with both of the novels is have a fairly clear timeline of what is happening in the real world at that time. And readers who, for example, who follow British politics will note, I mean, the events aren't central to the story, but there are sort of around the margins of the story, there are sort of references to things that are going on sort of in the political world at the time. And obviously, 2022 was quite a turbulent year. Remember that we got through a few prime ministers in that year and that sort of thing. So you have those sorts of things happening, and I think also the events, for example, in the war in Ukraine. For me, it was important that the book, whilst a work of fiction, could be true, so that if a particular battle was happening in Ukraine at that time, it could be possible that certain people would be there, or certain units would be involved, and that sort of thing. So I wanted that to be quite realistic, and similarly, again, the bits in Whitehall, the way that the organisations that are present at the meeting, and the sorts of things that they would want to raise in that context. Again, I wanted that to feel quite realistic. So yeah, I think my books are as you rightly observe, they are fiction. I've made it up. It's but there's quite a lot in there which has a sort of factual basis.
Yeah, and I think you could tell that, especially in the bits like that were set in the Foreign Office and things like that. You could tell that they were written by someone who knew what that was like.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that came across, because there is something about the atmosphere of that kind of that kind of environment, which again, as I sort of name checked Yes Minister earlier, almost that's a comedy, but it people love that, I think, because one, it's funny, but also it tells you a lot about how Britain works, and I think people maintain an interest in that. And I think we've lived through a turbulent period both in Britain. As I mentioned, we've had lots of different prime ministers, and more elections than usual, that sort of thing. But also, obviously, it's a turbulent period in the world, and I think a lot of people feel they'd like to understand more about what is happening and why. And in a way, I think fiction's a good way into that. We normally would say, well, if you want to know, pick up a newspaper or read a non-fiction or whatever. But actually, that's not basically, it's not much fun. Whereas actually fiction is an entertaining way, but it can still be informative, and that's been one of my objectives, to write fiction that is obviously entertaining, and hopefully it is that, but actually it somehow leaves the reader sort of better informed by the end of it.
Yeah, I particularly like Peter Haynes' fiction as well, and I learned a lot about Parliament from that.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's a good case study, actually, and it's interesting, actually. So you have those politicians, or people, or former politicians, or people who've been very involved with the political world. So there's the guy, the ITV news presenter who writes very good spy novels. His name has just escaped me, but it'll come back to me. But there are people like that who have a very that their knowledge of the political world is completely sort of real and up to date. Because Alan Johnson, again, is another former politician who's written some good thrillers, and I think there is something about that well, part of it is, of course, that a lot that happens in that world never finds its way into the papers, because people have got lawyers, and people will threaten to sue and all that kind of boring stuff. Whereas again, fiction liberates you from that. So it's a way sometimes to put perhaps real people with a little bit of a disguise on, to sort of insert them into the pages of your books. And I think there's quite a lot with sort of political thrillers, spy thrillers. There's always a bit of an overlap there. I'm not saying they're exactly the same, but there's overlap of style and so on. And perhaps that stuff is helped by the fact that it is fiction. So it enables people to say things that they wouldn't feel able to say in a kind of conventional non-fiction setting.
So another core thing in your book is the relationships between people and often their Ukrainian counterparts, or their sort of people that they have relationships with prior to the story. How hard is it in like that kind of pacey book that you've written to sort of build those relationships to be so believable as well?
Yeah, oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think one of the things which, without giving anything away, drawing on my own experience, is that when you work in a very intense environment, in a professional setting, you end up with these very intense relationships. And I'm not saying that they're romantic relationships necessarily, but they're just very intense. You can imagine if you're working in a war zone or somewhere that's a bit risky, or working in this kind of 24/7 type setting, those relationships become very intense, and sometimes I think they are quite often in those settings sort of cross-cultural, because again, you're thrown together. So yeah, you might have a Ukrainian special forces unit, but they're working alongside maybe some Brits or some Americans, or who knows, from anywhere. And so trying to portray that kind of intensity was important to me. And I think then also, in a way, that the world of intelligence, as I said earlier, there is this element to which the basic activity of intelligence is someone who has some information, sharing it with another person, but doing so in a secret way, and then that other person taking that information and using it. Maybe the government needs it to help them make decisions or whatever. That is basically what intelligence is. It's finding the person who knows something and persuading them to give you that information. And so that requires a different kind of intense relationship. And again, it's not a romantic relationship. It's not necessarily a friendship in a classic sense, but it is some kind of instrumental relationship between two people. So yeah, I think that in a way, depicting those relationships is sort of at the heart of a lot of spy stories, and certainly this story.
It was interesting as well. The other thing that I found interesting in it was the sort of use of Telegram and things like that as part of the sort of effort of spreading information on all sides.
Yeah. And yeah, so that's important. So one of the things, again, writing contemporary spy fiction, what I wanted to do was portray the way that people use technology in the modern era. And again, this is not James Bond gadgets, it's not watches with lasers or whatever, but it's, people, obviously, they use mobile phones, they use encrypted apps. I mean, funnily enough, Signal, which was, is an app, is a bit like WhatsApp. Maybe some listeners know about it. But it became very famous just about 6 weeks ago, or less than that, I think, when there was this big scandal in the US where they were using Signal to sort of plan a military operation. But I mean, that's a good example of how there are these apps that any of us can download. We can get access to these things, but people use them in these sort of contacts. And again, Telegram is another app that's a bit like that, which is more in the realm of the kind of the Russian-speaking world, is more popular in Ukraine, Russia, and countries like that. But I think there's other aspects to this. So the degree to which, obviously, all of us know that these days there's a huge amount of information about us online. Some of it we know about, we've got Facebook profiles or whatever, and there's stuff that's there online about us that we probably don't know about, or it might be leaked information, information that's being hacked. You get one of those emails saying, "Oh, I'm sorry to say that your account with, British Airways was hacked," or something, and then you sort of think, well, what do I do about that? But the upshot of that is that, as I say, a huge amount of personal information about everybody on planet Earth, pretty much, is certainly everyone in the kind of Western world, is online somewhere. And so the ways in which people use that information is very much part of the kind of modern world of intelligence.
Do you have you had any interest in these books being like adapted for television or film?
Yeah. So, well, the first one, that an option was taken up by a production company, a UK production company called Todd Films. They for people who are into sort of crime TV. They did a very good show. It was on Apple TV. I have to remind myself of the name of it because it had Peter Capaldi in it. And yeah, what is it called? It'll come back to me in a second. Yeah, so they've been a Criminal Record. Yes, so Criminal Record on Apple TV, which people might have seen. It's a very, very nice show with Peter Capaldi playing this kind of slightly sinister detective, and you kind of, again, he's one of those characters, an ambiguous character, I guess. Yeah, so they've, as I say, they've got an option. The second book hasn't been out for very long, so as yet, I don't know. Funnily enough, I've had some people say to me that they felt that the second book was sort of more suited to a screen adaptation than the first. So who knows what will come of that? I know that lots of writers get to the stage of seeing their work optioned, and of course, not many things actually find their way onto the screen. But of course, I'd be amazingly excited if it were to happen.
How do you find managing to market things and go to like author events and stuff when you have to be so careful about your image?
Yeah, that is a bit difficult. I'm obviously really delighted to be doing this session. I've done a few little smaller events, so I probably wouldn't be able to do a really big kind of book festival. I mean, I don't want to be self-important. I'm not saying I've been invited to loads of huge book festivals, but I think some of those really big ones where you have like hundreds of people all in one room, I think that would be a bit complicated. Whereas smaller ones, events at bookshops, things like that are okay. And in a way, I'm just sort of navigating slightly. One of the issues about my situation is that there aren't many people in my exact situation, in terms of having had the kind of job I used to have, and who are now writing books out, sort of the books that are on general release and available in normal bookshops and all that. So I'm slightly having to sort of play it by ear. I don't want to get into any trouble for obvious reasons, but equally, I want my book to be out there, just as any author does, as much as possible. I suppose at the end of the day, the in-person author events, I think, are wonderful, but they're probably as much for the author as they are for the reader, in the sense that you can do an event and there might be 20 to 50 people there, and obviously, if there's an online thing, or if there's a review on a website that lots of people see, then that might be thousands of people. So in the end, I think whilst there is a frustration there, I don't want to let it sort of become an obsession for me, because clearly there are loads of other ways that you can reach people, particularly social media. I am, just so listeners know, I'm on X, formerly known as Twitter. I'm on Blue Sky, which I guess is the sort of the cuddly Twitter these days, and I'm on Instagram as well, so people can find me. Oh no, also Facebook. Sorry, Facebook, and there's the Spybury Facebook group. Spybury, like library, but SPY, is a really nice Facebook group if you're into spy literature. It's got a few thousand members, so it's quite big, but it's got a very nice sort of atmosphere. I think it's kind of well moderated, so that there's no kind of trolling on there. It's a really nice community.
Yeah, that's a trick, isn't it? I think, and I also think bookish communities online are just nicer.
I think you're right. I think we are stereotyping, so I won't apologize for it. People who read books are probably nice people in general. So obviously, that you now and then someone will say they don't like your book. I don't mind that. I mean, genuinely don't mind that. I find it quite interesting when people say they didn't like my book, because I'm interested to learn why.
Yeah, and I guess it's sort of, they're not going to be books for everybody because they are based on very real events, and not everyone wants to read things like that, I guess.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact,
Um,
I had that feedback from a reader who is an enthusiast of spy books, and he said, "Look, I like spy books, but you know, and I get this. Lots of people read fiction for escapism. Obviously, you know, that's part of the sort of appeal. And perhaps if you feel a bit weighed down by what's happening in the world at the moment, you don't want to read a book that's all about what's happening in the world at the moment. Obviously, I'm not going to sort of argue that point, but I guess I would say that it comes back to I think my books are a way to. It's a kind of what's been going on. It tells the reader what's really been happening, but in a way that hopefully is accessible and gripping, and not a kind of boring, you know, politics book.
no, it was definitely very interesting to read.
Oh well, thank you.
I like to ask everyone who I interview what they've read
Yeah.
recently and really enjoyed.
Okay. Well, that's good. Well, the nice thing about getting your book out onto the bookshelves is that well, certainly I speak for myself, is that you feel liberated to do some reading of other books. So I recently read William Boyd Gabriel's Moon, and of course William Boyd is such an extraordinary writer because he's so versatile. So Gabriel's Moon is a kind of spy novel, but you wouldn't call William Boyd a spy novelist. You just call him a novelist. You know, he's written so many. He writes comedies. He writes sort of romances. You know, he's just so versatile. So I really enjoyed that. What else? I've been reading some nonfiction, some really good nonfiction recently. There's a book which is called How to Fight a War. Which it may not sound like it up everyone's street. I'm not planning to fight a war myself, but it's a it's by a guy called Mike Martin, who is he's a sort of expert. He's a former soldier. In fact, he's now an MP. He's in Parliament now, but he wrote it before he was elected. But it's about how warfare is changing in the modern era, and I found that quite informative. Another writer who I love reading, again of nonfiction, Ben McIntyre, who of course, you know, hugely successful writer, in his book The Siege, about the famous siege of the Iranian embassy, which was eventually broken by, you know, the famous sort of SAS raid which took place in that time in the early 80s. So yeah, those are just some recent sort of really good books that I've got into.
Good, that's a good answer. I like nonfiction too. I'm currently reading one about a history book about women, violence, and the law.
Interesting. I fear that might be a slightly depressing read, but probably full of quite a lot of sort of important stuff.
Yeah, I feel the same, but I think it'll probably be quite interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
We are coming up to the end of our time.
Yeah.
Would you like to remind people? I mean, obviously, we've had a lovely time with the book there. So,
yeah, exactly. So no one can forget it. Yeah.
Yeah. But remind them what they're going to go away and buy.
Yeah. So A Spy at War, published by Canelo, available. They've done a great job. So it's all over the place. I know it's in Waterstone's branches, and you know, all the other independent bookshops, of course. And even I've seen it the other day. I was in Heathrow Airport and I saw it in WH Smith there. So that's always a good sign. Yeah. So widely available. It is the sequel to A Spy Alone, by definition, and as you've said, that they work as standalone books. But if you feel you've sort of enthused by this discussion, then I encourage you to start with A Spy Alone. And there's a third book on the way, title TBC.
Are you ever tempted when you see your book in somewhere like an airport to sneakily sign it?
I'm very tempted, and the other thing I'm tempted is to sort of say loudly in front of someone, "Oh, this book's really good. I've heard great things about this book." So I think the other thing I know that authors do is that sort of thing where they shift their book so it's sort of near the front of the shelf and not, you know, hidden down on the, you know.
Donna says she's going to go and check out book one.
Fantastic. Well, Donna, thank you for your support. I hope you get a lot from it.
Doing the sensible thing of starting at book one, unlike me, who started at book two.
Well, it's yeah. As I say, I mean, they do work as standalones, but I guess if people like them, then you might as well start at the beginning.
Yeah, you should definitely always start at the beginning. And then all that's left to say is thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it, and it's just been a pleasure to have a chance to talk about my work.
You're very welcome.